Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Sheng, CEO of LeadrPro. LeadrPro is the first online marketplace directly connecting sellers with buyers of software. LeadrPro offers a PPM pay per meeting model. Chris, I'm so excited to chat with you, not only because of your founder experience. Obviously, this is not your first startup, so it's not your first rodeo. So really interested in diving into your background and your experience and what you've seen kind of over the years running startups and what's particularly interesting about how the market has changed, but also LeadrPro and how you're really kind of focusing on this two-sided marketplace and offering a lot of, I guess, relief to the headache from both of the sides, buyers looking for the right software, sellers looking to connect with the right buyers to be able to offer value. So interesting, excited to how you're able to do that through LeadrPro. But before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started the company?
Yeah, I mean, so the quick spiel is that I've been doing growth marketing for the past 10 years. I ran a growth marketing agency for the past 7. And then probably the past 4 years worked really closely with the venture capital community in Los Angeles. And so all in all, probably worked with 250 plus venture-backed B2B SaaS companies on go-to-market and growth. With LeadrPro, it's about a year and a half ago. I kind of hit an inflection point with the agency. Very comfortable lifestyle business. We were doing just under 3 million in revenue, but not as much personally or professionally challenging. And so was trying to decide whether or not I wanted to try attempt to scale up the agency, which service-based businesses are notoriously difficult to do so,
Yeah.
or maybe take a couple of the bottlenecks that we are dealing with from the agency, just in terms of like an execution perspective, and try to see if we could leverage tech and code to ultimately streamline any of those. So I shared those two ideas with one of the VC firms that I work really closely with, Mucker Capital here in Los Angeles, and their partners, and they suggested I do what ended up becoming LeadrPro. So that's where it started.
It was interesting also to think about this concept of growth because I think there's a lot of mystique behind it. It's thrown around a lot of ways, but what really are the tactics and the strategies that help companies grow and really kind of tackle growth from a really, I guess, intentional sense? And what do they set up? How do the targets? What in particular is growth when you're kind of ready to hit that point at a company looking to whether it's generate new clients, build out more product features, to attack new markets? What really is incorporated with a strong growth strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what you're trying to grow, right?
Hmm.
You're trying to grow a marketplace is very different from just trying to grow a B2B SaaS company from trying to grow a direct to consumer brand, right? Again, I can only speak really about my expertise, which is in the B2B side. And I think there's a few things. I think number one, the hyper growth of what we've seen in SaaS for the past 10 years, I feel like that, at least this is my hypothesis, is that we ended up adopting a lot of the conversion metrics that comes from the consumer world. Things like
Hmm.
PPC, PPM, uh, it doesn't really necessarily translate into the B2B
Yeah.
world, right? Like I can understand when somebody makes, let's just say the the fixed cost of making a leather bag, right, is like
Hmm.
$100. So I can understand that two different brands are going to pay $100 to make the same bag, but
Yeah.
based on perceived value or brand value, somebody's going to be willing to pay 10x, that for a specific brand versus 2x to another brand, right? But in the B2B world, it shouldn't be that way because a software or SaaS solution is to ultimately either drive ROI on top line revenue growth or improve bottom line margins. Bottom line,
Hmm.
right? It's got to be very tangible in terms of like what those outcomes look like. And brand equity, brand awareness, and I think brand visibility shouldn't matter as much in the B2B space. And yet we do a lot of these similar exercises that the direct to consumer brands do,
Yeah.
which really shouldn't be, to me, like doesn't make sense. So I think a lot of times the perfect example or use case would be like a CRM. So again, working with so many startups, like they gravitate towards a HubSpot or a Salesforce just because those are the behemoths in the place in the
Yeah.
marketplace, right? They don't readily realize a lot of times that there's a six-figure price tag to a consultant that you probably need to hire to make it actually work well for you in the way that's supposed to,
Right.
let alone or it's going to just like take a huge time suck from your internal team to actually like ad hoc built it out.
Yeah.
Separately, like just the cost from some of those platforms is like a HubSpot does a great job on their pricing model, right? It's like it looks very inexpensive in the very beginning, but
Yeah.
like 6 months into it, I've seen startups end up paying $1,000 a month. and they're like, oh crap, like this is like
Yeah.
really expensive and it's really eating into, and the reality is statistically that most of these companies aren't going to make it past 3 years. So like
Yeah.
you should actually try to find something that's much more cost effective that you can actually then scale into some of these larger platforms once you're actually ready to from an operational expense standpoint. So I think that's kind of like how I think about it. So now we think about growth in general. I think like the idea of growth hacking or just kind of like growth role from 10 years ago when I started off doing this, like
Yeah.
it's evolved a lot. I think now you see a lot of growth leaders. You see also like other kind of hot job titles like RevOps and all this kind of stuff
Yeah.
that's starting to populate and funnel up. Growth to me is a hybrid of what traditional marketing and sales used to be. So
Mhm.
marketing used to be just driving awareness, right?
Mhm.
Getting some kind of intent. And it could be intent can be used in the loosest sense of the word, like a click, a
Right.
lead gen form, etc. And then sales would take over at that point. And then work everything from doing the product demonstration all the way to customer close. Um,
Mhm.
in my world, like growth is now this hybrid of where, yes, you are generating awareness around the company, but you're also facilitating it all the way through to demo being
Mhm.
completed, right? And at
Mhm.
that point, it's then handed off to sales, where it's more managing the
Yeah.
relationship now that you have some understanding that it's a qualified prospect. And I think the way that I've done it, like not having a formal background in sales or marketing, has just been like not overthinking it and then
Yeah.
just being much more scrappy, right? So like
Yeah.
prior to me doing startups, I was doing finance for a while and I did entertainment. I did TV and film production for a number of years. And yeah, I think that checkered work history actually set me really well up for growth because at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it's all still about storytelling, but then be able to use data and analytics to ensure that you're scaling the story effectively. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what I found to be ultimately, I don't know, happenstance landed into this and in this role and ultimately where I found the most I think beneficial and best fit for me in terms of professional career. But I'm happy to
Uh,
dive in terms of like philosophically how I think about growth and all that stuff and
yeah. Well, I was just gonna ask you, how are the incentives different in growth versus like marketing and sales? And how are the I guess the intention different as well? I could see that at least if you boil it down, it's all about figuring out your objectives, right? So grow customers in a certain direction, and is every strategy leading towards that one thing versus acquire new customers or farm certain partnerships and things like that, which are I think more the detailed aspects of sales and marketing in that respect. But how are the metrics different, or are they not different than a traditional kind of sales and marketing department or function or motion in a
sure.
company?
Yeah, so I think you gotta break it down into baby steps. Like again, I think when growth is all about growing more customers, right?
Right.
Now, like you can get further down that flywheel of like how does customer retention then impact top line growth, right? Because
Yeah.
referrals, word of mouth, that kind of stuff, and having those flywheels in place where your customers are helping you get more customers, that's the
Hmm.
ideal situation. But
Yep.
let's just take it from like that's obviously more mature companies, much more sophisticated like sales processes. I think that's the ideal scenario to kind of work towards as a company. But in the early stages, just trying to get your first few customers, I think, and just kind of like grow up into a certain point and stage, it's all about just adding a higher a volume of customers. And then kind of working backwards from that is what I've done. So, how do we get to customers? Well, you need to get in front of them is the first thing, right? And what is your biggest asset? Typically in the B2B world, that will be like your salesperson. How do you get your salesperson to have some kind of interaction through a call or a video conference with the target customer? That's like the number one priority. So that's the first step. And then I think like, so if you move backwards from there, there's like your audience
Hmm.
that on paper is going to be a good fit for being a potential customer for you. So they're out there somewhere.
Yeah.
Now, how do you get in front of them to get them into this meeting, right?
Yeah.
And there's like now like maybe 15 to 20 baby steps from doing some kind of awareness or interaction or cold
Yeah.
outreach from getting that audience to be one, understanding of you guys exist, and then two, having enough trust or incentivizing or motivating them in a way where they are agreeing to essentially give them their attention, their
Yeah.
attention to you, right? That's the second thing. And then third thing would be like, all right, let's focus on the logistics of actually getting that attention booked into a slot of time,
Yeah.
right? And so those are kind of like the three major steps. And then when you think about it from actual go-to-market motion or how you actually execute on it, the first step is to understand who your target market is. And I think the general acronym that's thrown around is TAM, right? I'm sure you're
Yeah.
available, like
Right.
total
Yeah.
available market. That's a very common thing to throw around, especially to investors, etc. But the reality is, like, as a startup or early stage company, even if you're less than like 3 years old, in some cases I've seen like $500 million companies still be in this situation where like your TAM is not really who your core market is today.
Right.
And
Right.
most people don't do this, or most founders don't do this, but you truly have to do a TAM, SAM, SOM analysis. TAM is like where your company can service like 5 years, 10 years from now, right?
Yeah.
As your product evolves. But your product is not going to be in this most perfect scenario where it's ready to service that total market.
Yeah.
Reality, your product is going to take years, if not decades, to get to a place where it actually services the underlying mission and vision of what you want to set out to do and build, right? So you have to really look at, all right, my product is here. I have an MVP of the product. I have to look at my SOM, which is my serviceable, attainable market today. And from a timeline perspective, I think about it as like, who can I service today up to 3 to 6 months from now? And
Yeah.
then your SAM is your serviceable, addressable market. And that's who you're going to be able to serve as your product evolves 6 months to a year and a half from now,
Mm.
right? And that's
Mhm.
constantly on a rolling basis, right? So
Yeah.
3 months later, you're still going to be looking at your SOM in a sense that, yes, your market size may have expanded, but the truth is, like, what you might assume to be $1 billion TAM is like in reality maybe a $10 million SOM. And in
Mhm.
that case, you're not going to necessarily be able to acquire 100,000 customers in that TAM, but you might be able to acquire 1,000 customers in your SOM, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't do that analysis and you're trying to chase it like your tail, essentially trying to go all upstream to try to service 100,000 types of customers,
Yeah.
when in reality, one, even if you're lucky enough to like land one of those types of customers, you probably don't have a product that's sophisticated enough to retain them. And that
Yeah.
becomes a problem because that results in churn. And so where you really need to do is really take a gut check, reality check of like who actually is going to realize the most value today,
Yeah.
and just focus on creating a lookalike audience of customers that mirror that individual or that company.
Yeah.
And that's the first step, right? Is like to
Yeah.
understand that really on paper, put it down, make that as part of like your go-to-market understanding. And then
Yeah.
it's going to be like, all right, now where do they live, sleep, eat, breathe, either online or offline? That's when you start discovering, all right, are they on LinkedIn, or are they on Instagram, or are they on email, or are they
Yeah.
on Facebook groups or a LinkedIn group, for example, right? Like, I've worked with companies that sell into everything from like SMB, mid-market, enterprise, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes on the SMB side, like they're selling a SaaS product to funeral homes or like gym owners, or like, so gym owners are a very different type of breed than a VP of marketing at Gusto, for example, right? Like
Right.
psychologically different, motivations are different, life priorities are different. So the messaging is all going to be different. You really just need to know who you're trying to target today. And then once you know where they are, and I think when I say that, it's like, don't worry just about online, and don't worry just about the things at scale.
Yeah.
An example that I typically use will be like, if you are a direct to consumer product that maybe is like trying to target stay-at-home moms in affluent communities, because they are selling a direct to consumer good that is selling into either like the tween or like the toddler market or something.
Yeah.
What you could do is have somebody stand outside of a yoga studio between the hours of 11 to 3 p.m., right? In the middle of
Yeah.
the day, is that's most likely going to be like stay-at-home moms and do it in affluent
Yeah.
communities. Similarly, if you're trying to target contractors, what you might do is like you might have somebody stand outside of a Home Depot waiting for people who are coming out of there to interact with contractors. So there's always a digital version of what that physical thing looks like, but you need to be super creative of like what you're trying to do and how you're trying to get in front of the audience. Obviously
Yeah.
on enterprise, or like you can always then move onto these larger things like trade shows and looking at associations. The other thing that a lot of companies tend to miss is like if they are a SMB or mid-market company, everything from an acupuncturist, a massage therapist, to a hairstylist, to a accountant, they all need to be
Yeah.
licensed professionals, right? Licensed
Right.
professionals, there's going to be a public database of them. either by state,
Right.
by federal, or by local some kind of like local county database, right?
Yeah.
So you can always look up the license because they have to always re-up that license. So there's always a public actual database of all those individuals somewhere. If you do like license lookup, cosmetology license, you'll get a
Yeah.
link to all that. You'll all of a sudden be like opened up like, oh, these are like and they have a bunch of information there. And a lot of times it's going to
Yeah.
be the actual owners. So then it's like figuring out where they are and then start building a database of that.
Yeah.
And the database that you build, you want to understand the contacts, which are essentially going to be the channels that you have to get in front of them. You're not even getting to messaging. You're not doing any of this stuff yet, but
Yeah.
channels. So if like, for example, those federal, state, local databases, a lot of times they'll give you a physical mailing address,
Yeah.
sometimes an email address, and a lot of times a phone number. And the phone number is most of the times going to be a cell phone number, like a mobile device number. Now,
Yeah.
just between, let's just forget about email, but let's just look at physical mailing address and phone number. That gives you actually like 4 to 5 touch points and channels. And a lot of
Yeah.
people don't realize this. Physical mailing address, you can do direct mail, right? You can also have a foot traffic like rep actually walk into a location. The second, so that's 2 channels from a physical mailing address. From a phone number, which is like most likely going to be a mobile device, allows you to do ringless voicemail, SMS, and cold calls. So in total, between 2 data points, a physical mailing address and a phone number, you got access to 5 channels. And guess what? You can also digitize that by looking onto Google Maps. When you go into Google Maps and you start searching for like gym owners, or like, for example, like, I don't know, like physical therapists is another space that we've worked with. A lot of times the numbers that populate now on directories are going to be a cell phone number too.
Yeah.
Just kind of world that we live in. So you have five channels to now get your story in front of them, right? Now
Yeah.
you add an email. Now you can do retargeting. You can do email drip campaigns. You can find social media handles like a LinkedIn URL, Facebook
Yeah.
URL, or Twitter URL that gives you their ability to do direct messaging. From Twitter, you can do DMs. From Facebook, you can do DMs. And LinkedIn, you can also do DMs. And now
Right.
you're opening your plethora of channels to up to like 8 to 10 different ones. So that's the next step. And then the last step would be focusing on the messaging that you want to use, right? So
Mhm.
again, going back to that analogy of like a gym owner is a very different mindset than it is like a VP of marketing at Gusto or like a fintech, right? So the things that motivate them, their day-to-day pain points is all going to be different. The emotional triggers, what actually elicits a response from them emotionally are all very, very different. So that's the other part of it is like the messaging, as hokey as it sounds, we tend to bucket messaging into emotional triggers, whether it could be like FOMO, sense of urgency, nostalgia, whatever it might
Yeah.
be. And that way, based on the audience, we'll know which one to continue to drill down into, right?
Yeah.
And that's really important because what's really kind of like true is that you'll start seeing is that psychologically, personality wise, a lot of these types are kind of very, very similar. At least like 80% are going to be somewhat similar in terms of like who they are, right? Like the
Right.
types of people that become accountants are mostly a certain type of personality set versus the type of people who become salespeople are very different types of personality set. But they all
Yeah.
tend to be very similar. And so once you understand the messaging that works for that subset, then all of a sudden you're able to speak much more intelligently to them in a way
Yeah.
that they feel like you're listening and you're connecting. So that I think is the next most important step. And then I think this is more of like icing on the cake, but the idea here would be then leveraging multiple channels is
Yeah.
part of a single sales sequence, especially in the B2B world. So,
Yeah.
for example, in the consumer world, it's very common, right? It's like if I was, and I don't know why B2B companies think this way, but like again, I think we adopted a lot of things from just consumer, but not this part, which is if I just started like a no-name brand, like a brand new running shoe company, right?
Yeah.
And I just hit you up, Julian, through emails, like 4 or 5 emails every week just saying, "Hey, buy my running shoes, buy my running shoes. They're great because of XYZ." And that was my only channel. Most
Yeah.
likely you're just going to delete me or block me at some point, right? Um,
Yeah.
versus if I am a running shoe company and you see a billboard ad of that company while you're driving down the freeway, you see
Yeah.
a streaming ad on your favorite show on Hulu with that company, you see an ad pop up on your Instagram feed, and then you ultimately get, say, like an email or an SMS notification with a 10% discount code retargeting you because you had some kind of engagement from those other channels. At that point, you're probably much more inclined to be like, yep, I'm actually going to be running a marathon in 6 months. Happy to give this a shot, like kind of deal, right? And in the consumer world, we just tend to, in the B2B world, we just tend to hammer home the two primary channels are going to be LinkedIn and like email. And
Yeah.
if you're going to imagine like a recipient on the side of those things, I'm deleting or I'm just like at the end of the day, just ignoring a lot of those things.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you need to leverage multiple channels. Like again, get things where it's like you're doing email on day one, a LinkedIn ad request on day two, a
Yeah.
ringless voicemail day three, email follow-up on day four, an SMS text on day six, a LinkedIn DM on day seven, now that there's been time for them to add you, a
Yeah.
Twitter DM on day eight, a Facebook DM on day nine. You get what I'm saying? But like you can
Yeah.
leverage now
Yeah.
multiple channels to hit somebody up to get them to actually see your messaging.
We obviously talked about the research and identifying your profile. We talked about the different mechanics and channels that you can access. And once you kind of figure out that profile, I think one of the missing pieces thinking about, obviously we're deep into tactics on what works and going through these channels, but where do you measure if I'm a company, I have my top line funnel, I'm acquiring new customers, then I'm focusing on, all right, conversion. How do I get them down to actually purchasing my product, using my service? And how do I measure the success of those different campaigns? Do I know my customer that well? Is the messaging getting across? Is the timing? Am I strong in terms of when I'm capturing them in the timeline of their life cycle so we can capture them when the product hits the most? How do I measure those so I know what parts of the funnel are actually working well and what's
Yeah.
not working well on from a conversion standpoint?
So I think it's breaking it up into steps. So like, let's just say, for example, you're using email as a channel. I think like the
Yeah.
number one thing is that you're going to have to measure like, okay, I sent out, let's just say a cohort of like 100, and then I got 5 to respond, right? So response is just one metric that you need to measure. Well, before that, it's going to be
Yeah.
deliverability. So maybe only 99 out of 100 got delivered. And then out of those 99 that got delivered, how many actually opened, right? Let's just say it's like 50 out of 99 opened. So now 50 actually had a chance to read the message. Out of those opens, how many actually replied, right? And so
Yeah.
reply doesn't mean positive or negative, it just means response. And so
Yeah.
typically we'll look at response as it relates back to delivered, because that's super important for us, knowing that, again, for us at least, we know what's going to yield typically about a 40 to 50% open rate. So we can kind of like make assumptions around opens, around what visibility looks like. So we're really focusing on really the core output, which is response. But from
Yeah.
response, then how do you get to positive response, right? So
Right.
it can be positive or negative, but how do you get to a positive response? From positive response, then how do you get from there to then having them commit to a time for getting a booked meeting? And then from a booked meeting, prior to actually the day that the meeting happens, how do we make sure that they're actually good quality and qualified, right? So there's a way to insert questions in that time period. And then how do you then actually make sure that there's a high show rate by the time that they get to the day of the meeting, right? So at the end of the day, if you're not doing or optimizing for all those little baby steps, you're defeating the purpose by the time you get to the very bottom thing, right? So which is
Yeah.
having the meeting and then completing it. Because if you do a great job, for example, like getting great response rates, but only a super small percentage of them are getting booked, then that's the problem, is like you have to diagnose the issue is between, all right, well, we're getting positive responses, but we're not getting them booked. What's the reason there, right? And a lot of times what we've seen is that time decay is a very real thing. So if you're not getting back to somebody within 2 hours of when they indicated positive interest in taking a meeting, your
Yeah.
chances of booking them goes from 80% down to 30%. And so that could be essentially it, which is the frequency and how quickly you respond to positive responses. So from there, like then like say booked to actually showing up, like that's great that you got them to booked, but that's not end of the life cycle there, right? You have to actually get them to show up. So
Yeah.
we figured out like you definitely need to get a phone number, because notifications through email is just really noisy and gets lost a lot of times. So if you're not doing SMS reminders, your chances
Yeah.
of getting somebody to show goes from like SMS reminders, we see a 90% show rate. If you don't have SMS, then just email alone, it's about a 40% show rate. So like
Yeah.
those are just all these little steps where you need to understand and track the measurements of conversion, because that allows you to ultimately, not just about messaging, allows you to diagnose where the issue is, and then look, is it actually messaging, or is it actually a deliverability issue, or is it some kind of technical issue or some
Yeah.
logistical issue? Now, a lot of the times it's really not messaging at that point, because if you're getting positive responses, you got the messaging there. it's more so going to be a logistical issue.
Yeah. And thinking about LeadrPro, how has the landscape really changed now that there's so much noise in terms of,
Yeah.
there's so much software out there for buyers to actually get value out of whatever they're purchasing. You talked earlier about the challenges of paying for, say, a Salesforce as a small company, whether it's, it doesn't necessarily integrate well with what you're actually doing. You need a consultant to actually build it and it becoming more robust. And then on the flip side for sellers, breaking through all these channels to really deliver value, which is positive business outcomes for adding this tool, product, or service based on your current business needs. How has LeadrPro kind of brought the two kind of buyer and seller into this marketplace? And what are the incentives that drives them there through the noise? And how is some of the discovery process kind of taken out and kind of easily kind of introduced between these two parties?
Yeah. So the world that we're trying to build here is that, like, as an agency, we ran this idea of like using incentives as a way to kind of cut through the noise. So literally paying somebody $100 to sit through a demo. And you see this very common nowadays, and a lot of companies will run this exercise. They'll offer a $100 gift card for you to sit through a demo. Now, where I've seen a lot of that negative feedback come in, where it's like, well, they just end up coming in for the incentive, and they are not like a good qualified lead. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
probably because you didn't qualify them, right? So at the end of the day, what we found doing this 10,000 plus times as an agency, paying over $500,000, was that, like, look, we have an opportunity to use the incentive to, again, cut through the noise, get to a positive response faster, 8 to 10x higher response rate than anything we would ever see from something ROI wise. But then how do we get that into booked? We realized, again, under 2 hours, facilitate as many channels as possible, get them booked. So we really optimized for using the incentive to get somebody booked. Now we got somebody booked. How do we make sure that they show up? Not just that, but how do we make sure that they actually qualify? And so what we found is, like, when we got somebody booked, actually only about half of them were qualified, right? So
Really?
how we would qualify them is that, yeah, because like a lot of people are going to be like, yeah, I'll take $100 meeting.
Take a
But
meeting.
then you need to then, yeah, but then like what happens in between that time period we did was, like, we inserted qualification questions. So how we did this was like, can you please answer these 5 questions to help us better structure the call by the time we hop onto it? And they're essentially qualification questions. So it's asking them, like, what are you currently using around XYZ? What is your pain point and how big of a pain is it as it relates to XYZ,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, and ... right? So
Is that,
we
sorry, is
found,
that customized per kind of software that you're integrating, or are those kind of more general questions that as a filter layer?
well, it's pertinent to it's pertinent to each vendor or customer, right? Like,
Yeah.
or
Okay.
each, whatever the client, it's unique to that client, right? Or customer. So it's all going to be, it's not general. It's always going to be
Okay.
related back to the specific software service that company's selling. But what we found was, like, those qualifying questions allowed us to very quickly ascertain whether or not this person is actually sincere, and then they're actually in a buying pattern, right? And so anybody who was not in a buying pattern, we would just disqualify, and we would just be like, hey, sorry, we actually had enough conversations. We don't need to do this one right now. And we would
Yeah.
send them a $5 Starbucks gift card, and they'd go along on their merry way. And we found out that nobody got pissed off when we canceled the meeting, right? And so what ends up happening, let's just say, for example, you booked 10 of these meetings paying $100 each, right? Where you're on the hook for $1,000. Whereas most companies are going to pay $1,000 to complete the meeting, and then only half are qualified and realize it after the call. What we
Yeah.
were able to do is instead reduce that cost, because now we're only paying $5 for the ones that don't qualify. So if you take 5 that don't qualify, we pay $25 just to remove the junk out of that funnel. And then we
Yeah.
would pay $100 only for the ones that qualify. So we're saving our cost of that meeting by almost 50%. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's kind of, yeah, that's kind of the exercise that we ran. And then LeadrPro is now facilitating that in an automated format. So that was what we did as an agency. We found that worked really well. We understood all those nuanced steps. And then LeadrPro is now using a marketplace where we're connecting those buyers and sellers directly. So you got to think of it more so as like a consumer app, like Uber, for example.
Yeah.
Passengers and drivers both have to be registered on Uber for Uber to then facilitate an interaction, right, between
Yeah.
both sides. Same thing for us. So our buyers are actually registered users on our platform, and so are the sellers. And so based off of that, we're able to then facilitate a demo between the two sides. It's much more like a dating app for B2B sales than anything else. So that's why we're coming out with like a mobile app that's going to be released toward the end of this month.
That's incredible. And in thinking about the way to communicate the value of the marketplace to both sides, how do you communicate in terms of, from an organization standpoint, that whatever money that you're spending in booking these meetings is similar, if not less than what you would in terms of like the other campaigns that you're running, and it really does impact the LTV of your clients and your existing customers, but it also impacts the cost per acquisition. And how do you kind of relate those two, being that one, you have to pay now, so it's a little bit more of an immediacy bias versus seeing the long-term kind of cost of like a cost per acquisition through other channels and things like that? How do you communicate the teams that you're selling, the marketplace kind of ecosystem into that the money that they're paying for each meeting actually does directly influence those other outcomes that you don't see until later on?
Well, that's the problem, right? Like, so
Yeah.
that's what we're solving for. So essentially we are like the biggest hurdle for every B2B company is the ability to scale cost effectively, predictably, and consistently, right?
Right.
And that's because historically you're spending a lot to try to learn and then figure out what the cost is later, right?
Yeah.
For us, we do a pay as you go. So it's fixed cost per meeting, and you are able to make a decision as to whether or not you want to be committed to the cost of the meeting. So
Yeah.
you can accept or decline the meeting requests as a sales team before you actually commit financially to the cost of the meeting, right? So
Yeah.
you can review the answers to qualification questions, looked at buyer persona traits. You can see which company that they're at, potential size of the deal, even before you actually commit to anything. And so for us, we've created this world where at the seller side, like it's very easy for them to generate and understand what the ROI is, especially when we walk them through a demo and we go into our admin panel and we show them that 73% of our completed meetings turn into a sales opportunity for our customers. So it's a very high rate than what they typically would see internally because of the fact that we got really good at inserting these gating tools. So one is making sure that buyers only see things that are relevant to them, that's based on their company that they're at and then their job title. They're not seeing everything under the sun, right?
Yeah.
They're only seeing the things that are relatable to them. And then number two is like the qualification questions are unique to every single vendor, right? So like, for example, a Monday.com or a Mixmax, they'll ask point blank, do you have $50,000 to allocate towards a project management solution in second quarter of this year? And then number two, are you the individual that has the authority to make that purchasing decision alone? Right.
Yeah.
And based on being able to like ask those kinds of very like direct buying intent questions, you can cut through a lot of the BS. And
Yeah.
so by the time that they're accepting the meeting, they already know, all right, this company is actually evaluating. They have the decision making ability for making that purchase decision. We
Yeah.
definitely want to pay for this meeting, right? So that's how
Yeah.
we've taken a lot of the guesswork out of it. So there is no pay upfront cost. There's nothing like that. It's all very risk free, low, zero commitment or obligation to anything. You can sit there, receive a ton of demo requests, decline every single one of them, but our machine learning algorithm will pick up over it over time and then get you better matches within a 2-week, 3-week period. So that's kind of like how we started to facilitate these matches. Again, think dating app, right?
Yeah.
Dating app
Yeah.
where it's like actually the goal of a dating app is to make sure that they're facilitating interactions where there's a high quality of a match. And we're doing
Yeah.
the same thing. And then on the buyer side, they're motivated because number one, they get paid $75 to participate in these demos, which at the VP level or higher is not a huge motivator. It's more of a nice to have. And we've played around with paying them much larger and much lower than that. But again, they feel respected for their time. Secondarily, they can redirect anybody who's trying to solicit them in their email or their LinkedIn or any other socials. They can drive them back to their LeadrPro profile. So similar to a LinkedIn URL, you can share your LeadrPro URL across those different channels and drive anybody who's trying to solicit for your attention back to your LeadrPro profile. So the nice thing there is that anybody who pops up in my dashboard as a buyer is basically, I'm looking this as my source of truth for anything that's trying to get my attention, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I'm also getting compensated for that time. And then the last thing is like a third of them actually donate those proceeds to charity because they
Mm.
feel like at the end of the day, it's more so a good use of their time. A time and our attention is very, very much a commodity and an asset, right? That has an attached value to it. I don't know if you saw this, but recently IKEA, being the fact that they are usually like in really far distances, are now allowing people to make purchases using the amount of hours that they traveled to get to an IKEA store as part of a currency, which is
Yeah.
crazy to me. But it's to me like it goes with our underlying thesis, which is that we are essentially attention brokers. We are
Right.
brokering attention between two sides.
Yeah. And tell us a little bit more about the traction. How many customers are you servicing now on LeadrPro? How many are using the platform? What's been exciting about the growth up to this point, but what are you particularly excited about in terms of the next stage of growth?
Yeah, so we have a little bit over 50,000 on the buyer side. Those are going to be like from logos like Amazon, Tesla, Red Bull, Paychex, Masterclass, DocuSign, etc. All VP level executives, pretty evenly distributed across the 5 key departments. But the top 3 departments are going to be sales and marketing executives, HR executives, and then engineering, product, R&D executives. So basically, that is like what's driving our marketplace is the more
Mm-hmm.
the buyers that we grab into that fit that persona type, we are basically able to onboard or acquire any B2B vendor that's trying to sell into that particular audience,
Yeah.
right? So, on the seller side, we have
Yeah.
customers like Mixmax, Hire.com, Contract Book, Lyft Media, which is the media division of Lyft, Monday.com, for example. And we have almost like 100 different types of customers now that, again, mostly are selling into those top 3 departments across enterprise. We do have a mix also on the buyer side of more like C-suite founder level executives
Yeah.
from post Series A, Series B type companies. So that's kind of the mix of that audience. That being said, we're consistently trying to grow, trying to get more density across some of the other like departments like ops, also like finance and accounting, customer success, and then being able to then acquire more sellers or vendors that are trying to sell into that group. And the idea would be then doing this playbook and then replicating in a way where we can move more downstream into more mid-market and SMB. So for example, restaurant owners get hit up and bombarded a lot of times with tons of
Yeah.
restaurant technology, right? So what if we had a platform now where it can go downstream, get restaurant owners onto the platform as the way that they actually discover and
Yeah.
manage their tech stacks, right? And so now we can then go against like all those restaurant technology companies like Uber Eats or like a Tray or like some of these other like more sophisticated platforms, and then go and get them onboarded as customers because we
Yeah.
have that other side of the market. So that's kind of where I see like a lot of that growth happening. But what I'm really excited about is really kind of like helping to continue to facilitate value to both sides and really focus on stickiness and retention on the buyer and seller side.
Yeah. Whether it's external or internal, what are some of the biggest risks that LeadrPro faces today?
I mean, I think like the risks for us is really just like we are trying to build a moat around the fact that we are first to market and
Hmm.
really try to get separate ourselves as fast as possible just because we have that go to that first to market advantage. So like we're just trying to again like grow as quickly and fast as possible,
Yeah.
generate the playbook and be able to like, scale as fast as we can. But that's the biggest thing, right? It's like I think there are companies that are in different spaces that are large that can move into this space if they wanted to, but it would be almost like a repositioning of their core value prop, which it's not easy to do. So
Yeah. Yeah. Thinking if everything goes well, what's the long-term vision?
I mean, long-term vision, I'm not gonna lie, if we could sell the company in like 5, 6 years, like I totally would be open to it. I think like I don't think enough founders are very like practical in that sense of like thinking about
Sure.
what outcomes they're looking for. But that would be great for our investors. It'd be great for our team who all has equity in our business. But I think also just like if we weren't to sell, like we just kind of like continue to build and build and build. I think like I imagine that what we're doing on the B2B side is almost proving a larger use case
Yeah.
for the direct consumer experience. Going again back to that idea of like our attention is an asset, our time is an asset and
Yeah.
commodity. Like I imagine that whether it's us pursuing this or some other company pursuing this, that in a dystopian society, like based on my experience and my level of expertise, I provide a certain level of value, right?
Yeah.
Based on your experience, your expertise, you provide a certain level of value. And so based on an intent of a conversation that me and you want to have together, right? There's going to be somebody who's going to be gaining more out of the conversation, right? And so what could happen is that if there was a certain amount of credits associated to me, a certain amount of credits associated to you for that interaction, and then like whoever is gaining the most out of that would be paying a certain amount of credits or that credit differential between the two sides to then the other recipient in order for them to level up, almost like a game. Like that's where I feel like there's a world or opportunity to create that where we tap our mobile devices to one another and there's a financial transaction that actually takes place, whereas through tokenization or whatever it's happening, but then a value that is shared with every single interaction that we deal with so that our time is actually being accounted for in
Yeah.
this monetary way.
Yeah. I always like this next section. I call my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions and we'll see where we go. So
Sure.
first one, I always like to break it open in is what's particularly hard about your job?
Just spending so much time in different, like building out process across different departments, right?
Yeah.
So from sales, customer success, buyer side growth, ops, engineering, etc. So being able to move along and facilitate where I'm helping to ideally make everybody else's lives easier by making my life more difficult, I suppose. But like building process is super critical, and the only way that you truly scale is by having process in place.
Yeah. From a marketplace standpoint, being that qualifying and almost measuring both sides is extremely valuable and kind of almost adding filters, whether a type of company, a type of industry, size of team, product, all those things that really kind of qualify and, I'm sure the machine learning engine use those variables to correlate or essentially not interact. How do you define what is worth measuring versus what is not? Like, do you need to know the skin, the hair color of the person or the eye color from the buyer side? Obviously, that's a little bit too granular, but what essentially do you kind of decide on what's necessary to measure and how
Yeah.
much of those measurements changed over time to help kind of feed into a more accurate recommendation engine that, you've built
Yeah.
inside?
Feedback loops, like
Yeah.
feedback loops from both buyers and sellers, right? So like when we launched less than a year ago, like we had these grandiose ideas of like, hey, we want variable pricing. So if it's like a senior executive from Microsoft, that should be valued differently than a founder at pre-seed startup, right? Like
Sure.
that attention should be, but like at the end of the day, we didn't have enough data to justify what the algorithm should actually look like, right? So
Yeah.
I think part of it is like just understanding that you need to acquire data to make intelligent decisions, and then you need to get that feedback loop to validate the data, right?
Yeah.
So we can see data, we can make hypotheses and create thesis all day long, but then we need to validate it from the end users. And so that's what we got really good at. We operate under like a 3 strikes policy. So the idea there is like we either on the seller side need to hear from 3 different sellers or 3 different customers a request for the same product feature or function, and then we'll prioritize it on our roadmap.
Yeah.
If it's just some one-off, like asking for something, we're not going to build.
Yeah.
And the same thing on the buyer side. We have to hear at least 3 unique buyers that bring up the same thing. And if they bring up the same thing, we'll start prioritizing it. But that's how
Yeah.
we start really like getting into a place where, every algorithm, every like learning, everything, every variable that goes into the input for the output is all measured and calculated in a way where it's none of us making that decision. It's not me having my ego in the way or making a gut decision. It's all driven by data and then feedback.
Yeah. And how is your kind of manual to automation formula or process in regards to what do you have in terms of kind of the more manual decision-making process or even evaluation, and then automating it so that a lot of that function is done within the platform, within the ecosystem? What's
Yeah.
your formula for that in for other founders out there that are looking to really automate a lot of the process? Because without automation, there's just no scale. You can't be doing the same task over and over again. It should shorten the amount of time or just not do it at all. But what's the formula for understanding what's necessary to automate and what's not? Because automating everything,
Yeah.
it's not worth the time investment and the resources. But what's your kind of thought on that?
Redefine what you think MVP is.
Yeah.
That's what I say. Like MVP basically could just be a button where it looks like it's automated engine, but your users think it is. But on the back end, it's literally like I'm looking at the data and I'm trying to scramble to fulfill what that button's supposed to do, which is
Right.
fine, right? Because what we want to do is like maybe nobody's gonna click on the button at the end of the day. Right.
Right.
And like you need to figure out like how many people are clicking on the button. And then you need to understand, well, what does success look like? Is 30% clicking on the button make sense? 40%, 5%?
Mhm.
If it's under a certain threshold, don't build the automated version of that. If it's above that threshold, then you go ahead and you justify the build. But then that's how we do it is like we'll have ideas for different functions and features, etc., or we get something that's requested from us that we think like actually maybe this makes sense. But again, before we like put that on the onus of the dev team to go build it,
Yeah.
we'll just have them just do something that takes like maybe 30 minutes for them to throw something up, and then we'll test it. And I think
Yeah.
that's a better way of trying to do it than it is to spend days, if not weeks or months, trying to build something that somebody may not ever use.
Yeah, I like the redefining the MVP. What does success look like? What are you trying to move towards? What's the simplest impact you can have and start collecting that information versus starting to build all the things, behind that once there's at least adoptability and then traction in that, whether it's a feature set or whatever the MVP looks like. I like that. I always like to ask this question because I love how founders extract knowledge out of anything they ingest, whether it's early in your career or now. What books or people have influenced you the most?
How to Win Friends and Influence People. I mean, like that's Andrew Carnegie. I mean, for like that's like my go-to. I think also David Goggins from like Can't Hurt Me. I think the
Yeah.
idea of just understanding really where to dig deep on. I'm really motivated and I get inspired by people like that, like the David Goggins, or like also I think just people who are like have an immense amount of work ethic and just hustle and grit. A lot of times I think like I've been that person, that dude on the couch that had a million and one ideas, like the idea for
Yeah.
Netflix before Netflix, but I never knew how to execute, let alone like what I was supposed to be doing on day one. Fortunately, like I have friends that like knew the world of tech, and like I was able to get integrated with them on our first startup. And at some point it hit me that the matrix is real. And at the end of the day, you have the option of like, you want to be a creator or consumer, right? Like
Hmm.
make that choice. To me, that's really the red pill and blue pill differential. Like you can either be a builder or you can be somebody who's actually just going to be consuming. And I think that's the biggest thing. And realizing that tech and through code that you can pretty much build anything. And now with OpenAI, like there is really literally no excuse for anybody who has that hustle to like not be able to figure some shit out, to
Yeah.
end up like a side hustle or doing like 5, 6 figures
Right.
as a side hustle. So
Yeah. Yeah. I know we've gone over time here, but I've been enjoying the
it's all good.
conversation, understanding the kind of how you view marketplace, how you view testing different parts of your business, parts of your product. I always like to make sure we didn't leave anything on the table. So last little bit before we close out here, Chris, is there any question I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to bring up before we close out here?
I mean, I would just say that like number one, it's never too late. Like I was a guy doing like my first startup, making $12 an hour at my early 30s, answering phones before I ended up figuring out my professional life journey and my calling and my purpose. So one, never too late. I think two is also just like when you get to a point of being sick and tired of being sick and tired, let's quote that from Dumb and Dumber. But like when you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, like dig deep into what that actually means to you. Do you want to be like that for the rest of your life? Or do you want to use that as motivation for you to take whatever that next step is and make the risk to do that next step, even though you don't know what it's going to look like? So many
Yeah.
people will talk themselves out of it, worrying about what the 10th step is going to be and thinking like, okay, well, I'm going to run into this barrier on the 10th step. When in
Yeah.
actuality, you're most likely 99.9% of the time never going to run into that barrier, because by the time you make that first decision, your path is going to have so many different types of different variables that's going to
Yeah.
lead you to so many different ways that you didn't even think of before. And I think that's the one thing like that. If I can ever drill anything home in anybody, is just take risks, take the first step. Don't worry about even the second.
Yeah, yeah. What Martin Luther King Jr. said, you don't have to see the whole staircase to take the first step. It's a similar sentiment in that regard. It's like
Absolutely.
you can't go upstairs if you're not walking. And so that was like a really powerful thing. And I love that. Last little bit, Chris, is where can we find you and support you, be a fan of you, and also LeadrPro? Give us your plugs. What are your LinkedIn's, your Twitters? Where can we be a supporter of you and what you got going on?
Yeah, I'm pretty much available on all socials for at the Chris Sheng. Sheng is Sheng. So you can hit me up there. I have personal coaching that I also offer for anybody who's interested at chrissheng.com. If you're interested in listing your business or being a buyer on LeadrPro, you can go to leaderpro.com, which is LeadrPro.com.
Amazing. Chris, it's been such a pleasure learning about your experience, kind of how you view building, how you view kind of not only building a company, but building a product and growth strategies in ways that really companies can go not only understand their buyer more, but also go and attack them and find different ways to measure their tactics and really kind of bring everything down funnel to overall do what we all want to do, which is grow revenue, grow profit, and target our customers and add value in the right way. So Chris, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you. I hope you enjoyed yourself today, and thank you again for being on Behind Company Lines.
Of course, thank you so much, Julian.
Of course.